The deadliest event in European history wasn't the Black Death. It was something far more sinister that struck decades earlier. No army, no disease, just weather that turned into a civilization-ending monster. And climate scientists are seeing the exact same warning signs today. Well, here's something they don't teach you in history class. Between the years of 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced what historians now call the Great Famine. But calling it a famine is like calling the Titanic a minor boating incident. The temperature dropped so drastically that chroniclers described it as if God had forgotten to pay the heating bill for an entire continent. Rivers that hadn't frozen in living memory turned into solid highways of ice. The Thames, frozen solid. The Baltic Sea, you could walk from Denmark to Sweden without getting your boots wet. But here's where it gets terrifying. We're not talking about a bad winter that lasted a few months. This nightmare stretched on for 7 brutal years. 7. That's longer than most people keep the same smartphone these days. The death toll was astronomical. Conservative estimates suggest that 10% of Europe's population simply vanished. Gone. But some regions, they lost up to 90% of their people. Entire villages disappeared from maps like they'd never existed at all. Medieval chronicles from survivors paint a picture that would make a horror movie director jealous. People were grinding bark into flour just to have something to chew on. Families were abandoning their children because they couldn't feed them. And the weird part is, many of these communities had been thriving just years before. Think about that for a second. In 1314, farmers were celebrating bumper crops and planning expansions. By 1316, those same farms were frozen graveyards where nothing would grow. The speed of this collapse was absolutely mind-bending. It wasn't a gradual decline that people could adapt to over generations. One season, you're planning your daughter's wedding feast. The next, you're fighting your neighbor over moldy grain scraps. What makes this even more chilling is how unprepared everyone was. Medieval Europe had been enjoying what climatologists call the medieval warm period for centuries. Populations had exploded, cities had grown, and agricultural techniques had become specialized for mild weather. Nobody saw this coming. The transformation was so complete that some historians describe it as Europe's first true apocalypse. Trade routes became death traps, major cities turned into ghost towns, political structures crumbled faster than stale bread. And here's the kicker that should keep you up at night. Before this catastrophe struck, Europe was actually experiencing some of the best weather it had seen in generations. Before Europe became a frozen graveyard, it was actually having the time of its life. We're talking about the medieval warm period, basically nature's version of a really good mood that lasted for centuries. From roughly 900 to 1300 AD, Europe was warmer than my grandfather's stories about walking uphill both ways to school. Temperatures were so pleasant that Vikings, yes, those tough guys who raided villages for fun, were growing barley in Greenland. That's like finding palm trees in Alaska today. This wasn't just a little temperature bump either. The warmth was so reliable that farmers started planting crops on hillsides they'd never touched before. It was like Mother Nature had cranked up the thermostat and forgotten where she put the remote. But here's where it gets interesting. Population exploded faster than popcorn in a microwave. Cities that had been sleepy villages suddenly bustled with merchants, craftsmen, and enough people to make medieval rush hour a real thing. Food was abundant, trade routes flourished, and life was good. Then there's the cultural boom that followed. Gothic cathedrals started sprouting up everywhere, those massive stone giants that still make tourists crane their necks today. Universities opened their doors. Art flourished. It was Europe's golden age, all thanks to some extra sunshine and longer growing seasons. Medieval folks got comfortable, really comfortable. They built their entire way of life around this warm, predictable climate. Crop varieties that needed longer summers became staples. Trade networks expanded to regions that were previously too cold to bother with. Well, here's the kicker. They had no idea this warmth wouldn't last forever. The shift, when it came, was brutal. Imagine planning a beach vacation and ending up in Antarctica instead. That's essentially what happened to an entire continent. The transition from this medieval paradise to the killer winter wasn't gradual like changing seasons. It was more like someone flipped a cosmic light switch. One decade, farmers were celebrating bumper crops and expanding their fields. The next, they were watching those same fields freeze solid under layers of ice that wouldn't melt for months. The irony is almost cruel. The better things got during the warm period, the harder the fall became. Larger populations meant more mouths to feed when food disappeared. More complex societies meant more systems to collapse when everything went sideways. This sets up a terrifying question that scientists are still grappling with today. What actually caused such a dramatic flip? Now here's where things get really interesting. Scientists have been scratching their heads for decades, trying to figure out what exactly caused this medieval nightmare. And honestly, they're still arguing about it like kids fighting over the last slice of pizza. The leading suspect is volcanic activity, but we're not talking about your average mountain having a bad day. Multiple massive eruptions likely happen within a short time frame, spewing so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it created what scientists call a nuclear winter effect. Think of it like Mother Nature decided to install blackout curtains across the entire sky. Mount Tambora's eruption in 1815 gives us a taste of what this looked like. That single blast caused a year without a summer, leading to crop failures and famine across the globe. Now multiply that by several volcanoes going off like firecrackers. Makes you appreciate clear skies, doesn't it? But wait, there's more. Solar activity plays a massive role too. The sun occasionally decides to take a power nap, reducing the energy it sends our way. Scientists have identified periods called solar minimums, where sunspot activity drops dramatically. When this happens during an already cold period, well, that's like turning down the thermostat when you're already wearing 3 sweaters. Ocean currents add another layer to this puzzle. The Gulf Stream, which acts like Europe's personal heating system, can shift or weaken due to various factors. When that warm water stops flowing north, Europe essentially loses its climate insurance policy. It's like having your furnace break down during the worst blizzard of the year. Tree ring data from this period tells a fascinating story. These ancient growth rings show sudden, dramatic changes in growing conditions. The rings become incredibly thin, sometimes barely visible, indicating years of severe stress. Trees don't lie about the weather. They're like nature's accountants, keeping meticulous records. What makes this truly terrifying is that these factors likely work together. Volcanic ash blocked sunlight while solar activity decreased. Ocean currents shifted just as temperatures were already dropping. It was a perfect storm of bad luck that created conditions Europe had never experienced. The scary part? Each of these triggers can still happen today. Volcanoes still erupt, solar activity still fluctuates, and ocean currents remain vulnerable to disruption. While our technology might help us predict some of these events, stopping them, that's still beyond our pay grade. But understanding the causes is only half the battle. The real question becomes, how did this frozen hellscape actually unfold day by day? When the freeze hit, people didn't just die from cold, they died from something far worse. Hunger became the real killer, and it arrived faster than anyone expected. You know how your stomach growls when you skip lunch? Well, imagine that feeling lasting for months. Medieval folks stored grain for winter, sure, but nobody planned for a winter that wouldn't end. Their food supplies ran out like a smartphone battery at 1%, except there was no charger coming. The psychological torture was brutal. Families huddled together in their tiny homes, burning furniture just to stay alive another day. Some records describe people wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, looking like medieval marshmallows. But here's the thing, even the strongest, healthiest people started dropping like flies. Starvation works differently than most people think. Your body doesn't just gradually fade away. First, it cannibalizes your fat reserves. Then it goes after muscle tissue. Finally, it starts eating vital organs. The process turns grown men into walking skeletons within weeks. Children suffered the worst fate. Their small bodies couldn't handle the calorie deficit. Parents faced impossible choices: share the last scraps of food or watch their kids waste away. Many chronicles from this period read like horror novels, describing mothers who stopped producing milk and fathers who grew too weak to search for food. Then there's the social breakdown that nobody talks about. Communities that had helped each other for generations suddenly turned suspicious. Neighbors started hoarding. Trust evaporated faster than morning dew. Some villages posted guards around their meager food stores, treating bread like gold bullion. The really messed up part? Even wealthy nobles weren't immune. Their fancy castles couldn't conjure food from thin air. Money became worthless when there was nothing left to buy. Aristocrats who once feasted on elaborate banquets found themselves gnawing on leather boots. Talk about a humbling experience. Disease followed close behind starvation, but it almost seemed merciful at that point. Weakened immune systems couldn't fight off simple illnesses. A common cold became a death sentence. Entire bloodlines just vanished from history, leaving behind empty manor houses and untended fields. Personal accounts describe a strange silence that fell over Europe. No children laughing, no market chatter, just the howling wind and occasional creak of abandoned buildings. Villages that had bustled with activity for centuries became ghost towns overnight. But what made this human catastrophe even more terrifying was its speed. Unlike plagues that spread gradually, this disaster struck everywhere simultaneously, leaving nowhere to run and no time to adapt. When entire kingdoms start falling apart, you know things have gotten seriously out of hand. And that's exactly what happened during Europe's medieval deep freeze. Cities that had bustled with merchants and craftsmen became ghost towns practically overnight. Well, not literally overnight, but close enough to make your head spin. People didn't just pack up and leave for a weekend getaway. They abandoned everything they'd ever known because staying meant certain death. Trade routes? Forget about it. The roads that once carried spices from the east and wool from England turned into frozen death traps. Imagine trying to push a cart through 3 feet of snow when you're already half starved. Makes your morning commute look like a luxury cruise, doesn't it? But here's where it gets really messy. Political systems that had taken centuries to build crumbled faster than a stale cookie. Kings and nobles who'd grown fat on taxes suddenly found themselves ruling over empty lands. Hard to collect tribute from frozen corpses. The church, which had been everyone's go-to source for answers and comfort, found itself completely stumped. Priests who'd confidently explained God's will for decades were left scratching their heads. When your entire worldview is built on divine providence, a 90% death rate tends to shake things up a bit. Then there's the ugly truth nobody likes to talk about. Some leaders saw opportunity in chaos. While most people were dying, certain crafty nobles hoarded whatever food and fuel they could find. They turned survival into a business model, and not a very ethical one. Resource distribution, which had never been great to begin with, became a complete joke. The feudal system worked when peasants could grow food and lords could protect them. Remove the food part of that equation, and you've got a recipe for total social breakdown. Power vacuums opened up everywhere. Local strongmen emerged in some areas, while others descended into complete anarchy. The careful balance of medieval society, lords, vassals, serfs, collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. Communities that had cooperated for generations turned against each other over scraps. Neighbor fought neighbor. Brother turned on brother. The social bonds that held civilization together snapped under pressure. What's truly remarkable is how quickly everything unraveled. We're talking about societies that had existed for hundreds of years disappearing in what amounted to a historical blink of an eye. And the strangest part? While humans were busy destroying each other over the last bits of food, nature itself was writing its own story of survival and death. When that killer winter hit Europe, humans weren't the only ones getting the raw deal. Mother Nature decided to throw her worst tantrum at everything breathing, crawling, or growing. Picture your neighborhood during a regular snowstorm. Birds huddled up, dogs reluctant to go outside, maybe a few brave squirrels still raiding bird feeders. Now multiply that misery by about 1,000, and stretched across months. That's what wildlife faced during this medieval deep freeze. Livestock became ice sculptures faster than you could say frozen dinner. Cattle that survived previous winters dropped dead in their tracks. Makes you appreciate modern heated barns, doesn't it? Pigs, sheep, horses, they all joined the grim parade of casualties. These weren't just animals, they were walking bank accounts, transportation, and food sources all rolled into one furry package. The really heartbreaking part? Even the wild animals that typically laughed at winter got their comeuppance. Bears went into hibernation and never woke up. Deer herds that roamed thick forests found themselves trapped in what essentially became outdoor freezers. Birds that usually migrated south got caught off guard, like showing up to a formal dinner in flip-flops. But here's where it gets scientifically fascinating. Rivers that had flowed for centuries turned into solid ice highways. Sounds cool until you realize that fish populations got wiped out completely. No flowing water meant no oxygen circulation. It was like someone unplugged the entire aquatic ecosystem. Trees tell an incredible story too. Scientists studying tree rings from this period found growth patterns that look like nature hit the pause button. Ancient oaks that had weathered everything suddenly stopped growing. Some forests became graveyards of frozen timber, creating landscapes that resembled giant pickup sticks games. The ecological domino effect was brutal. No insects meant no pollination the following spring. No small animals meant nothing for predators to hunt. It was like watching a massive game of Jenga collapse in slow motion, except each falling block represented an entire species in certain regions. Well, here's the kicker. Some animals actually thrived. Wolves, believe it or not, had a field day. With so many frozen carcasses lying around, they basically lived in an all-you-can-eat buffet. Talk about making the best of a bad situation. This environmental chaos didn't just reset nature's clock, it completely rewound it. The survivors faced a world where normal rules no longer applied, but nature's resilience would prove remarkable in ways that still surprise modern scientists. The question becomes, how did anything manage to bounce back from such complete devastation? When the ice finally started melting, survivors crawled out like moles emerging from underground tunnels, blinking in the sunlight they hadn't seen for months. What they found wasn't exactly a warm welcome home party. The landscape looked like someone had taken a giant eraser to civilization. Fields were mud pits mixed with rotting debris. Buildings had collapsed under snow weight. Roads? Forget about it. They were basically suggestion lines at this point. But here's where humans showed they're more stubborn than a mule trying to avoid bath time. Instead of throwing in the towel, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The survivors, and remember, we're talking about maybe 1 in 10 people who made it through, had to rebuild everything from scratch. Think starting a video game over, except this time you don't get 3 lives and the difficulty is set to nightmare mode. Agriculture became completely different. The old farming methods had failed spectacularly, so communities started experimenting. They developed new crop rotation systems that could handle unpredictable weather. Smart cookies, really. Some areas began growing hardier grains that laughed in the face of cold snaps. Then there were the social changes. With 90% of the population gone, the rigid class system got shaken up like a snow globe. Suddenly, a surviving peasant might find himself managing an entire estate because, well, everyone above him had frozen to death. Talk about climbing the corporate ladder quickly. Trade networks had to be rebuilt from the ground up. It's like trying to reassemble your grandmother's china after dropping the whole set. Possible, but you're definitely missing some pieces. New routes opened up. Different cities became important. The whole economic map of Europe got redrawn. Archaeological evidence shows some fascinating innovations during this recovery period. Communities started building homes with better insulation. Apparently freezing nearly to death is quite the motivator for improving your heating situation. Who would have thought? Recovery wasn't uniform, though. Some regions bounced back within decades, while others took over a century to reach their previous population levels. It depended on factors like geographic location, remaining resources, and frankly, how lucky they got with the weather afterward. The survivors developed what we might call climate paranoia, and rightfully so. They started storing more food, building better shelters, and keeping detailed weather records. Can't really blame them for being a bit jumpy about winter after that experience. But here's the million-dollar question that kept these medieval survivors awake at night, and should probably keep us awake too. Here's the unsettling truth about our modern world. We're sitting ducks for another deep freeze. While we pat ourselves on the back for weather apps that can't even predict next Tuesday's rain correctly, the same forces that devastated medieval Europe are still lurking out there, like a grumpy mother-in-law, waiting to ruin Christmas dinner. Scientists today have identified the usual suspects that could trigger another catastrophic winter. Supervolcanic eruptions remain public enemy number one. The Yellowstone supervolcano alone could pump enough ash into the atmosphere to block sunlight for years. Then there's solar minimum periods, where our friendly neighborhood star decides to take an extended coffee break, leaving us shivering in the cosmic cold. But here's where it gets really interesting and terrifying. Our modern civilization might actually be more vulnerable than those medieval peasants. Sure, they didn't have central heating, but they also didn't depend on a global supply chain that moves faster than gossip in a small town. One major disruption, and those just-in-time deliveries become just-too-late disasters. Consider this. The average American city has only 3 days of food supplies. 3 days. Medieval villages at least stored grain for months. We've traded resilience for convenience, like swapping a sturdy winter coat for a fashionable but useless windbreaker. Climate models suggest that a volcanic winter could drop global temperatures by several degrees within months. Makes sense, right? The 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption cooled the planet by half a degree for 2 years. Scale that up to a supervolcanic event, and you're looking at crop failures that would make the medieval famine look like missing lunch. Well, there's some good news hiding in all this doom and gloom. We have early warning systems that medieval folks could only dream of. Satellite monitoring can detect volcanic activity and solar changes years in advance. Plus, our understanding of climate systems means we're not completely flying blind into the storm. The weird part is how unprepared we remain, despite all this knowledge. Most governments treat extreme climate events like that relative who only visits during disasters, acknowledged but not planned for. Emergency food reserves exist, but they're often designed for short-term disruptions, not multi-year climate catastrophes. Our ancestors survived the medieval freeze through sheer human tenacity and community cooperation. The question isn't whether another deep freeze could happen. It's whether our interconnected, just-in-time world could adapt fast enough when nature decides to flip the switch again. And frankly, that's a gamble that would make Vegas bookmakers nervous.